Welcome to the Immigration Lawyers Podcast. I am the host, Attorney John Khosravi, and I practice U.S. immigration law exclusively. For more information about the program, please visit www.immigrationlawyerspodcast.com. Please note that this recording is informational only and does not constitute legal advice. Please consult with a licensed attorney for specific legal guidance that suits your case. Also, this recording is copyrighted and written permission is required for rebroadcasting. For more information about me, please visit www.jqqlaw.com. Hi everyone, welcome to episode 113 of the Immigration Lawyers Podcast. I'm so happy you could join me today. I'm using some new sound equipment, so I'm not sure how the voice is going to come out, but hopefully it'll be a warmer, a better sounding podcast than it was before. And I know that I've been out for a while. Recently I've been trying to do like 2 a week. But between the public charge changes and the mad dash to file a bunch of adjustment cases before the public charge rule comes into place on August 15th or October 15th, and the amount of time it takes for my training programs that I've started and the coaching programs for immigration lawyers, it's been really hard to do extra material here. I'm still doing a lot of videos, but it's behind the training program on the website, Immigration Lawyers Toolbox. I don't post them as often on websites like YouTube or LinkedIn and stuff, but there's still daily stuff coming out. It's just it's a premium product now. But there is constantly agency updates, and I still want to do podcast episodes where I talk about that kind of stuff. But right now, for example, the visa bulletin was just updated today for October, and the employment-based preference categories had a huge jump forward. And most of the date of filing dates are current for world category, not India and China and stuff. But an EB1, unfortunately, is still backlogged. And just, other stuff that are happening. But I just felt like talking about a different thing. And I've just been spending a lot of time recently reading about immigration law. Because, there's been a lot of, crazy kind of immigration rules that are changing under this administration. And, they affect racism. They affect country quotas. That's the most controversial part right now of how we deal with people from certain countries, the travel ban. And so I thought, like, where is this coming from? This is so, outside the box. So I thought, well, let me look into the history of this kind of stuff, because there is the idea or what happened, the factual aspect of like the Chinese Exclusion Act. I'm like, I remember reading about this stuff in high school or hearing about it. But it's, on a day-to-day practice, not something that comes up. So I'm like, let me look at that and see how they dealt with it then. And that opened up Pandora's box of history and hours of study, and that prevented me from doing a podcast sooner. So I was going to do an intense podcast, kind of like hardcore history, if you guys listen to that podcast. And what happened was I got overwhelmed with the amount of information, and I was trying to check sources, all this kind of stuff. And I said, hey, listen, I'm not an official historian here. I'm going to talk about things that I read on Wikipedia, and then I read their sources, went to Westlaw and studied a couple of cases. And instead of doing like a 10-hour program, I'm just going to talk about like the first 20 or 30 years and then study some more, then do the next 30 years, just move the history up. Because every time I look into it, there's all these nooks and crannies and stuff. For example, I was looking into, I don't even want to give examples because that'll open up a bunch of other stuff that's going to pop up. But let me just get started about this stuff. So it's going to be a history of law and immigration episode. And so a lot of it's just mostly history. So that's the focus of this podcast. If you're interested in this stuff, it's interesting stuff, man. I got to say, you really got to know this stuff on a personal level. Every American should know it, and just to see where we're coming from. And the interesting thing is, like, nothing ever changes. It's always the same things going on. Life seems better. We're not dying of the flu, a pandemic, and that kind of stuff. And, if I have a pain, I go to the doctor or get my teeth fixed. I don't die from having bad teeth nowadays. But, the issues with immigration, racism, global war, global trade, scarce resources, drugs, all this kind of stuff is the same exact kind of stuff. So let's take this back a little bit at the 1850-ish era. Or 1848 to be exact. And this is where I'm going to start the story off. And it's so hard to pick because I could go back 10 years and find stuff that were the roots of what we have here and lead it up there. But I just going to pick 1848. And the reason for that is that's when the treaty between the U.S. and Mexico happened. This was the war the U.S. had with Mexico, the Mexican-American War that was going on. And it's really a land grab where U.S. got chunks of land. And they signed a treaty I think it was called the Treaty of Hidalgo. What was it called? And so in 1948, this treaty was signed, the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. And this is important because we're going to go into, Chinese restrictions, all this kind of stuff. But having this backstory is very important. So, Mexico, the U.S. Had a war, and U.S. essentially got, all of the Southwest out of it. And a week before the peace treaty was about to be signed, gold was discovered in California. And the famous gold rush, which essentially made California what it is, happened because that, brought a lot of money into the state. It brought a lot of power to it, and it brought a lot of people to it. The three things you need. And so, Mexico lost out on that one, but that mad rush and the increase in the size of the United States becoming a coast-to-coast, nation. I think, Washington State was probably there, so we had coast-to-coast action, but, the majority of the West Coast was obtained during that time. And so there's a lot of different aspects that pop up from what happened there. Before we get to the Chinese population and that kind of stuff, which is going to be the larger focus of this historical discussion, when I was reading about the Treaty of Hidalgo or Guadalupe Hidalgo, interestingly, essentially, Mexicans were living here in California during that time. So what they did as part of the treaty is, they drew the lines at the border, and they said that if you were Mexican and you were essentially north of the borderline, you have 1 year to make a decision whether you want to be a U.S. citizen or a Mexican citizen. And they don't really go into dual citizenship, which nowadays would be okay. But so they have a year. The default is you become a U.S. citizen if you don't make a specific check, but you will not be a Mexican citizen. There are nuances in New Mexico. They did certain things a little differently. But interestingly, I had a different podcast, last 2 or 3 podcasts ago where I talked about, citizenship was only entitled to white people. And so it wasn't until way, way later into modern history that it was opened up for, other races and other colors, all that kind of stuff. But for the purposes here, from essentially 1948 to 1920, Mexicans were considered white, and they were able to obtain U.S. citizenship. So that was a fascinating aspect that goes to all, the racial stuff I talked about and obtaining citizenship and all that. And so that was really interesting right there. And also, Mexico had a history and legacy of community property rights, at marriage. And when California became part of the U.S. and eventually became a state, that legacy of community property rights was adopted from Mexican legal history and scholarship. So part of the legal legacy of California is based on being formerly part of Mexico. So that was a little tidbit that became interesting. But let's go into what came about after the war and the peace treaty. Well, California became part of the U.S. and massive amounts of gold were discovered. So what happens when you have no immigration policy and you have a bunch of gold sitting in the land? Everyone wanted to come. So, the Mexicans were here. They were essentially citizens at this point. So it was hard to discriminate and stop them from getting the gold as opposed to, the white population. And Native Americans, they didn't have much power during this era. And so large numbers of Chinese citizens began coming to the United States and increasing their population. Also, with the increase of land size in the United States being coast to coast, the decision was made to make the transcontinental railroad. And something that industrious and intensive required a lot of manpower. And that was another reason why they needed large numbers of Chinese laborers to come to the United States and do really dangerous stuff. The Rockies are a dangerous zone right there. And so they needed to explode parts of the mountain and do really dangerous stuff. These people were dying, getting maimed by the large numbers. But they were there to do it. And so it was a huge changing time in American history where railroads were coming in, gold was found, a huge amount of land was increased to the country. All this kind of stuff was expanding and going forward. And so along with that, there was a need for population increases and just manpower. And that's what happened with Chinese immigration at the time, because we didn't have specific preventions from people coming here, any immigration laws that would have stopped it. Now, one thing to note is, and you see this, and again, we're talking about how things were different in the past, but they're the same. At the time, slavery was still legal in the United States, and in the South, slavery is happening. So part of this got to look at, how are people dealing with this when you have this labor pool of Chinese people coming in, and they're getting paid low wages in the West, and they have slave labor in the South, which is zero wages. And so what is the perspectives of people there what is the worry of the slaveholders when they could say, well, their slaves may see other people are getting paid to do the work, but it's an interesting concept. I haven't thought that through, but there's a lot going on there as to the perceptions of, we have free labor, or we have cheap labor. But what a part of that comes is nowadays when we look at the Democratic Party, it's talked about as Democratic Party is the party of the people. And part of that is labor. Labor was always, in my lifetime, has always been a part of the Democratic Party. And nowadays, everyone assumes that the Democratic Party is a party of immigrants. But this has always been two conflicting points, because domestic labor has historically been not a friend or potentially an enemy of immigrant labor, because it, in their minds, undermine the wages of domestic workers. And you see the Democratic Party right now, a lot of times people think if a Democrat comes in, they're going to change things, make immigration better, but that's not necessarily the case. And that hasn't happened in Democratic administrations for many decades. So we see that even here, where once the gold started coming down and the railroad started being built, all of a sudden we had a bunch of Chinese nationals in California, and it created a lot of problems between the white population, the domestic population, and the foreign nationals that are Chinese, who then started going to major cities like San Francisco and making their own communities there. It got to a point where they even passed laws like a Foreign Miners Tax Act of 1850. And so they would tax, miners that were coming in, so to kind of, stop them or to make it a little harder for them to compete with domestic labor that was doing the mining. And so this competition obviously bred a lot of resentment and issues and fights and violence, and that was going on during this time. And interestingly, the first governor of California, Peter Hardeman Burnett, he was an avid racist. And I mean, when you say racist nowadays, it has more meaning. Back then, racism was just like saying, "Oh, I drink water." I mean, everybody too. Now, I'm sure the Chinese people were racist against white people. Even nowadays, everyone's racist against each other, in my opinion. But it had a different perception and exception back then. So this guy, Governor Burnett, the first governor of California, he was a strong proponent of all these exclusionary policies towards foreign miners, in particular at the Chinese, and he was a strong pusher of what would become the Chinese Exclusion Act. It even pushed for black people to leave the state of California or face public flogging and all these crazy kind of stuff. So that was what was going on in the state of California at the time. There was a lot of money in business. It was kind of pulling back, and so competition between people that came to California and couldn't find work or get money, and their political support was creating a very uncomfortable atmosphere for Chinese nationals that were in the United States. I'm assuming other nationalities as well, but obviously Chinese were the biggest number and easiest to spot, as opposed to if someone was Polish or something comes to the United States. So yeah, as I was saying, labor at this time was really, really pushing anti-Chinese laws. They blamed the Chinese for the depression of wage levels, and they were demonizing Chinese workers and immigrants that were in the United States. Now, when you look at China, what was going on there at the time? The Chinese emperor at first, supported exclusion of Chinese people in the United States because they were worried about losing domestic labor there. But then, as their financial situation started getting better, and they probably saw the money being sent back, they were supportive of the immigration, and they were very unhappy with the Exclusion Act and the race-based legislation that was happening. I mean, it got so bad in California, the legislator passed a law that said it's illegal for any person of the Chinese or Mongolian races to enter the United States. But this law was struck down by a state Supreme Court in 1862. But that was it. So let's look at a little bit wider aspect of what was going on with China at the time. China was going through a very terrible period internally, where the imperial forces of the world empires, especially Great Britain, were really putting force on them. They were not able to defend themselves. And so this was near the end of the Second Opium War. Now, the Opium War, that could make you can make hours of podcasts about that whole situation. But essentially, Great Britain was a international dominant country, and the easy 2-second explanation is they kept buying a lot of tea from China and not be able to pay them back properly. They were paying with silver, but they're running out of silver. And so the smart British people were like, well, we'll pay them back in opium and make a bunch of money like that. So they got Chinese people massively addicted to them, and forcing China to accept, trade terms and open up their ports so they could have monopolies on the importation of goods, especially opium. And so this created a lot of problems. There are opium wars that happened. By the end of the Second Opium War, which had begun in 1856, ended in 1858, there was a treaty signed between various powers. So the Qing dynasty in England, along with Russia, France, United Kingdom, and the United States was actually a party to this treaty, the Treaty of Tientsin. This was amongst what Chinese people call, and rightfully so, the unequal treaties, because the Qing dynasty was so weak that the foreign powers could really push them and force them to accept things. And this included opening up their ports for trade and permitting foreign legations in the Chinese capital, essentially open up embassies there, allowing Christian missionaries come. And a lot of times when Western forces send Christian missionaries, it is partially a diplomatic aspect and also a way to enforce ideology and to have troops on the ground bring back information. So it's always a mixed bag of what missionaries do. Not all of them, but there are part of them that are almost like CIA kind of style stuff that are there. And with the Opium War being the name, it effectively legalized the import of opium, getting the Chinese domestic population addicted to this crazy drug. So you see this trade issue popping up then, but what's interesting is in 1868, the U.S., during President Lincoln's time, decided to open up trade with China, and they signed this agreement called the Burlingame Treaty. And this was a landmark treaty that happened between China and the U.S. It was one of the first treaties, or probably the first, where the parties to it, the U.S. and China, didn't enter it on unequal footing. The U.S. treated China as an equal here and as a friendly nation. And part of that, they gave China status as the most favored nation in trade, which essentially removes a lot of the trade barriers and which removes a lot of the trade barriers and costs for them to be able to, share trade and openness with each other. So this was something 1868. Right now it's 2019. President Trump talks about, putting China as the most favored nation. This was something done in the 90s, especially in the 80s, opening up China in the 90s to give them better, more favored trade relationships so they could increase and grow, what China did. But back in 1868, this kind of conversation was going on. A lot of times millennials especially think 1868, people were living in caves back then. But all this kind of stuff, this international trade, all these issues existed at the same time. So other than the trade stuff, one thing that's really important as part of this to know is part of the agreement, it granted certain privileges to citizens of either of the countries residing in other country. For example, if a U.S. or a Chinese national was in the United States, they could attend public education. They could go to school here automatically. And they could come here for curiosity, tourism. They come here for trade, or even as permanent residents. It essentially was an ESTA visa waiver for Chinese nationals to come here, which could be a student visa or lawful permanent residency. It was open. They specifically withheld naturalization and citizenship. So that was withheld, but it was open and fair game for them to come. So that was really interesting. And the Chinese nationals took advantage of this. It worked the other way around as well. Unfortunately, this didn't last long. And in 1880, a treaty called the Angle Treaty came about, which suspended Chinese immigration, but didn't completely prohibit it. It still allowed those to be here to take advantage of the rights of those that were given, go to school and permanent residency, but not for new arrivals. And then as we fast forward, we see that the trade status of China became a big hot button issue in Washington and in politics because businesses here were getting frustrated and anti-Chinese sentiment started growing. Industrialists and politicians were constantly promoting anti-Chinese activities. And so by 1882, that treaty was abrogated and the free immigration clauses were put aside for Chinese nationals coming here. But let's go back a little bit to 1875. Actually, let's go back a little further just to recap. So there was the Mexican-American War. California became a state, started doing the gold rush, trains, a lot of Chinese immigrants coming here, passing good relationship acts for more Chinese to come. But then the pushback started to happen. So one of the major pushbacks, which is interesting that they put, was the Page Act of 1875. And this was the first restrictive federal immigration law in the United States. So that's very important. This is when things started happening with immigration law and specifically banning people. And this one effectively prohibited the entry of Chinese women, marking an end to open borders in the United States. So it's very interesting. They said Chinese women can't come here because what they thought at the time, or what the argument was, that because of all these men who had come to the United States to work as laborers, a lot of the Chinese women that were here that did come, because most of the time they would probably stay at home with their families, the ones that are here end up becoming prostitutes or what they consider undesirable jobs. And so what they thought was forced labor for them as well. And so they were specifically prohibited from coming to the United States. But at the same time, this idea of not wanting to have, foreign labor coming in and depressed wages, what they called, coolie laborers, they imposed a fine of up to $2,000 and a maximum jail sentence of 1 year for anyone trying to bring a person from China, Japan, or any East Asian country to the U.S. without their free and voluntary consent for the purpose of holding them to a term of service for work. Now, how do you enforce something like that? How do you prove it? Especially back then, who knows? But the ban on East Asian women was really harsh, especially Chinese women, and that was, the first travel ban, I guess, that popped up, and it grew from there. I mean, it was at a point where the American Medical Association, the AMA, and this is one of the reasons I don't trust these so-called associations, institutions, because, it's just some corporate entity. Who knows what the people behind them think? But they said they believe, and there's a quote here, says they believe Chinese immigrants carried distinct germs to which they were immune, but from which whites would die if exposed. I mean, thinking about it, the American Indians got really, really messed up because of the germs that the Europeans brought and wiped them out. So there may be some factual basis for the germ theory of it, but to say that Chinese immigrants brought those when they were already here for so many years and that wasn't the case, that's just pure racism. But this fear became concentrated, especially in Chinese women, because they believed they were coming here and being prostitutes and then transferring that to white men that would visit them and pushing it into society. And then another worry with the 14th Amendment, at this point, we're going past the Civil War, it's 1880, there was worried that if these Chinese couples have children, or there's mixed couples, they have children, those children would automatically become U.S. citizens, and then their cultural practices would increase, and they would start to dominate with the numbers that they have. So a lot of this stuff was there just as the same arguments to immigration are today. So it was to a point where if a Chinese woman did want to come to the U.S. and they could prove they're actually wives of the laborers, wasn't just a single woman coming through, they had to go in Hong Kong and go to the embassy there and have to go through very hard process, getting an official declaration of purpose to immigration, to immigrate to the U.S., and a morality statement, have an application fee, and they would have to have a careful medical examination before they would come. So you see these immigration stuff was starting there that we're going through with not the I-693, but what are the medical documents for immigrant visas to the embassy. This was all happening way back when, 30, 40 years ago. And so they have statistics in 1882, for example, during the first few months before the enactment of the Chinese Exclusion Act and the beginning of enforcement, there were almost 40,000 Chinese nationals who entered the United States, but only 136 of them were women. But paradoxically, the U.S. wanted less Chinese women to come because they argued there was more prostitution. But by skewing the balance and the ratio of men to women, Chinese men to women, so dramatically, this actually increased prostitution in the United States. And so exactly did what they were trying to prevent happening, especially among the Chinese female populations, the ones that were able to make it. So a lot of times when the government makes these decisions in all aspects of our society, I would say majority of the time, the opposite result happens. You see this with the drug laws, and you see it with all sorts of things. Whenever they make a decision to try to police society, the opposite happens. You saw this with alcohol too, that comes in Prohibition about 4 or 5 decades later. Now, the 1880 treaty was a first hardcore one, but there was actually one before that in 1879, and this was the 15-passenger bill. The bill forbade sea vessels from bringing in more than 15 Chinese passengers in any single voyage to the U.S. The shipmaster was required to present a sworn list of all Chinese passengers upon arrival, and they would have a fine if they violated potential prison time as well. And so this was a different way of trying to decrease immigration but not stop it completely. Before the 1880 treaty that stopped women, and then after that the Exclusion Act. Now, the 1880 treaty did still continue the rights and privileges of Chinese laborers in the U.S. If you're already here, they would still nominally respect you. But the goal was to suspend the immigration of skilled and unskilled labor and stop that. But they're still allowing white-collar professionals. But at the time, white-collar professionals weren't a big part of the population. So we're getting to a point where the Chinese Exclusion Act kicks in. But this was the atmosphere before that. And we'll talk more about this in the next podcast on this subject. But so you see at the time, the Civil War was popping up. The nation was drained of finances and a bunch of people were dying. All of a sudden, a large labor pool opened up that were previously, free labor, but now they're part of the market labor economy. And, gold was running out essentially in California. The trains and all that stuff were made. We had a bunch of financial bubbles that are popping up. And so all the financial issues, and there's a core of financial insecurity that I see usually cause this anti-immigration sentiment, and I see that here. But that gets coupled on with internal prejudice and just people being irrational. But you see that popping up in essentially the same situation we have now, and this is the period between 1850 and 1880, and that's when we see the resentment pushed to a point where the initial immigration laws in the United States are actually found. Not the citizenship laws. There was citizenship naturalization laws at the very beginning of the Republic, but this is when with permanent residencies, for student visas, for trade, all this kind of stuff, the restrictions and country-based restrictions come into play. And so in the next podcast, we're going to go over what happens next and how those are enforced. And this is when you see the initial INS, precursors come up, country quotas come up, and the whole system that we have today starts to be developed at this time. Thank you so much for listening to this episode of the Immigration Lawyers Podcast, and I hope to pop up and study the rest of it and break it down for you guys, because it's a very interesting historical situation to review, especially during the times we're going through right now. Until next one, have a good one. Bye-bye.